Ambassador, thank you for being here. To pick up where we just left off with Dan, the notion that in talks in Islamabad this weekend being led on the U.S. side by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, Israel will not have a formal seat at the table. As the U.S. side tries to make progress in a deal with Iran, is anything that they are willing to agree to at this point acceptable to Israel, or are there minimum conditions for the Israelis that must be met here?
Well, first, I believe that the fact that the parties are going back to Islamabad to negotiate indicates that they have an interest in diplomacy and don't want to go back to war. As far as Israel is concerned, I believe Israel will go along with whatever diplomatic outcome the U.S. goes for. As was mentioned, we are not at the table. And it's for the U.S. administration to determine the outcome. However, there are close consultations between the Israeli and the U.S. governments where Israel indicates its interest. And one area I would emphasize, I think it was mentioned by your reporter, is the issue of the ballistic missiles. That was one of the main reasons Israel decided to launch the war against Iran, because the way they built their ballistic missile program constituted a serious strategic threat to the state of Israel. There's concern in Israel that if the deal does not include limitations on the numbers and on the range of Iranian ballistic missiles, they will rebuild their capabilities, and we'll have to find ourselves fighting another war in a few years. So it remains to be seen if and to what extent this is included in the negotiations.
From your experience as a peace negotiator, Ambassador, how much confidence does Israel have in Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff at the negotiating table?
Well, I know them personally. I think they are very capable negotiators, and they are the ones that brought about a deal in Gaza that released all of Israel's hostages. But ultimately, diplomacy is dictated by political interest. As far as while we were fighting Iran together, shoulder to shoulder, Israel and the United States, we're almost fully aligned. When diplomacy speaks, I do see some gaps. But as I said, ultimately, it is for the United States to determine the outcome. And you have a very challenging Iranian negotiator, and I'm not sure Iranians are capable of taking decisions right now, given the turmoil inside Iran in their decision-making process.
Mm-hmm. Well, to that exact point, Ambassador, that's also what President Trump cited when he extended the ceasefire indefinitely, what he called a fracture in Iran's leadership. You obviously have the new supreme leader who no one hears from very frequently, the Araghchi, and then the political leadership. Can any of them credibly be agreeing to a long-term deal at this point? Is it something that, even if it can be reached and negotiated out, is likely to hold when we're seeing such fractures?
That's an excellent question. I do see some major gaps in the positions of between the United States and Iran on the major issues, on the nuclear issue, on Hormuz, on other issues as well. And I'm not sure there are people in Iran who are capable of bridging those gaps and taking the necessary decisions. So either diplomacy will fail, or the parties might go for a very limited diplomatic outcome, which will allow for extending the ceasefire, possibly opening the Strait of Hormuz, because without that, I don't see any deal. And some kind of an arrangement regarding the high-enriched uranium, which the United States, for good reason, wants to be shipped out of Iran. There are several possible solutions, and possibly other issues will just be postponed or kicked down the road.
Ambassador, there's a lot of reporting about the munitions stockpiles here in the United States that need to be replenished, the number of missiles and interceptors that have been fired already in the course of this war. The New York Times today, in fact, says the U.S. has burned through 1,100 long-range stealth cruise missiles built for a war with China, firing off more than 1,000 Tomahawk cruise missiles, 10 times the number we buy each year. And the Pentagon has used more than 1,200 Patriot interceptor missiles in the war, something that Israel knows quite a bit about. To what extent is Israel facing a similar need to replenish stockpiles in this conflict?
Well, there's no doubt that Israel burnt a lot of munitions during this war. And we have to remember, we are at war since October 7, 2023. And we've been fighting on numerous fronts in Gaza, in Lebanon, against the Houthis, against Iran, in Syria and elsewhere. So definitely a lot was burnt, and this is a challenge. Israel's government recently, our Ministry of Defense, just signed some contracts to accelerate the production of the necessary munitions because war may not be over. So that is definitely something that our government is giving a lot of thought to.
You mentioned Lebanon, Ambassador. President Trump did announce the extension by 3 weeks of the current ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. But Hezbollah obviously remains a factor separate to the Lebanese government. What is your degree of confidence that Hezbollah is willing to abide and cooperate in some kind of longer-term fashion?
Well, the fact is that since the first ceasefire was announced in Lebanon, Hezbollah has not abided by the ceasefire. They've been firing every day, mostly at Israeli forces in southern Lebanon, but also sent some drones trying to infiltrate Israel's territory. They do not see themselves bound by this ceasefire, but ultimately I think the announcement of the extension of the ceasefire is important in that it gives space to the governments of Israel and Lebanon. Both of them are aligned in the goal of disarming Hezbollah. So it gives them space to start negotiations. The ultimate goal is, of course, peace deal and normalization between Israel and Lebanon. But before that, we have to reach a security arrangement that will enable the Lebanese government and Lebanese armed forces to disarm Hezbollah. Mm-hmm. The challenge was always the balance of power between them. The Lebanese army did not feel strong enough facing Hezbollah. So the key point here is to change that balance, to weaken Hezbollah on the one hand and to strengthen the Lebanese government on the other hand, and that is the goal of the process.